Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the October 23rd, 2019 School Committee meeting. Let us start with a Pledge of Allegiance to the flag.
Of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right, the first item on the agenda is public participation. I'd like to remind those who are participating in our public participation section of the meeting that they have 2 minutes, and they are to address the school committee as a whole. So the first member we have is Mr. Mali.
Moyun Mali, 53 Chester Street. Good evening, honorable members. In this important election year, our city witnessing continuous atrocities by Columbia gas fire destruction. We are grateful to Honorable Superintendent City of Paris for keeping our schools open during the crisis. Our public school, with the impeccable leadership of Honorable Superintendent City of Paris, moving forward. Now we have the best family resource center to bring our parents and educators together. Because of Honorable Superintendent awesome leadership, we are working hard to address the issue of attendance in our schools. Our public school with the best budget and new revised calendar make us proud to see the rebuilding of historical Oliver School. Lawrence Public School have the best teachers. We support our great teachers and their union. While our citizens still are suffering from the Columbia gas fire and explosion, Maura Haley, as a worst Massachusetts Attorney General, has not done nothing to help the victim of this fire and crisis. The great Nelson Mandela said, education the most powerful weapon to change the world. With the best leadership of Honorable Cynthia Paris, our public school, our children, they have hope. As the great immigrant city, we are ready to say, Lawrence always unite, Lawrence always strong. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mali. The next community member we have is Thomas Myers.
Thanks. And Marianella, I have to say I'm going to violate your initial rule. And quickly, what I want to do is start by publicly thanking Stacy Seward and Marianella Rivera for your time and tenacious work on the school committee as advocates for public education, advocates for programs for kids, and advocates for democratic control over our school committee. And I think you've really been mentors to so many people in the community who have seen the outstanding work you've done in the community as strong advocates. And I asked the members of the committee that are here and are running for re-election to really try to work and continue with those who comprise the newly elected school committee towards a transition plan, developing one and putting the receivership board on notice that you intend to move in that direction. If not, running for election and being elected to a board with no power sort of demotes you to the same status as a junior high school student government, where teachers set up the agenda and everything is choreographed and you think you have power and you really don't. And you guys know that you don't have power, but you should. And as a citizen, I find this, and I've said this here publicly, a tremendous insult to every citizen in the community, along with our elected officials, when we vote and we elect people and then they are unable to have power. Look around at the education level of all of you on this committee. You're as educated as any community school committee in the Commonwealth. And you should be able to have the oversight as constituted by law as a school committee. So again, I just wish to reiterate my sincere thanks to both of you for the tremendous job that you've done. If we can give them a round of applause, there's not many here, but we can all clap loud. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, Mr. Myers. All right, next up, we have myself. Good evening, everyone. I'd like to start by making note of the gross and utter disrespect for the democratic rights of the citizens of Lawrence. There are a couple violations that I want to highlight tonight, and the first is that there were community members present at the space that was set to host our June school committee meeting who witnessed school department staff setting up for our scheduled meeting, but were disappointed to learn that it was canceled by the chair less than an hour to the scheduled start time due to space issues that they saw just did not exist. The second was that it was voted by the majority of school committee members to add participatory budgeting to our agenda, but that did not make it onto tonight's agenda. These issues illustrate how this receivership disenfranchises our community. Our school system is nearing a crisis, and many of our students are already affected by it. I don't know why there are members of this committee who have been silent and have failed to advocate publicly for our youth at our meetings, while some of our students are abused and placed in relaxation rooms that look more like isolation chambers in Middleton. Many of our kids are being shoved down the school-to-prison pipeline. Bathrooms have been locked, and strict policies dictate when and how many times students can use them. Students with behavioral issues aren't being suspended anymore because the suspension rates were so high that now students are being sent home early, and it doesn't have to be marked as suspension. With this clever solution, our suspension rate has magically gone down, but students are being denied the support and education they need. I could go on, but at this point, I'd rather let the silence of certain school committee members show their complicity in this crime against our students in our city. Thank you. And that completes our public participation section of the meeting. Next item on the agenda are communications and reports. The first item up is district accountability, the district accountability presentation.
Thank you. So tonight, we're going to have an accountability data presentation followed by the enrollment presentation. In your materials, you can follow along. I will go ahead and review and discuss each slide, pause for comments, and happy to answer any questions at the end of each presentation. As a reminder, the Massachusetts Accountability System is designed to measure how our schools are doing and what kind of supports may be needing. Last year, when I presented this to you, I showed you the various indicators. There are 6 in total, and so tonight I will be reviewing all those indicators and sharing with you our performance. The performance of each of our schools is relative to one another, and they are measured against each other, specifically with school growth and student growth. So in this slide, we'll see the classification that's based on the overall percentile. From left to right, you see our schools that are requiring assistance or intervention, and those are schools that have accountability percentiles, which are 10% or low in subgroups in their performance. To the right, you'll see schools not requiring assistance or intervention, and those are schools with accountability performances of 11% or greater and no low subgroup performances. You'll see that we have 9 schools identified by the state requiring assistance or intervention.
School committee member, Ms. Mariano.
Superintendent, 9 schools requiring assistance or intervention. Could you tell us what that looks like, what the intervention piece would be?
Sure. As an example, we have 2 schools that we have redeployed additional supports this year to include professional development opportunities for teachers and their school leaders. In addition, we have deployed additional FTE supports for things like social emotional and counseling services for, just as an example, for 2 of those schools. Those are additional interventions.
There's no, I'm sorry.
It's okay.
There's no plan or anything that the schools need to write.
The schools do have to draft plans. Those plans are currently underway. We're going to be reviewing them as a district later in the winter. But right now, the first layer of intervention is very immediate. So it comes in the form of FTEs that we had budgeted for and reallocation of those resources, and additional resources in the form of professional development.
Thank you, thank you.
Any other questions with regards to this slide? I know I have a question. Why are the schools listed as an alphabet soup and not explicit, transparent information regarding each school?
We believe that our schools are part of the larger system, and so we prefer to keep the identity of each school and their performance as a whole district versus school by school. This information, as you know, is public, so I'd be happy to send you the link to where each school's performance is as it refers to each individual school.
Can you provide the school committee with a graph just like that, just listed with the schools?
I would be happy to provide the school committee with the link to each individual school where you will see each performance of the school.
Are there any other questions? Okay.
Next, we have progress towards improvement, and this is a school's progress towards the state set goals. Each school has their own goals set by the state, and those are determined by previous performances. So what you see here is the overall progress, and what you'll note in the chart above is the performance between last year and this year, and we have quite a bit of schools that have moved into the improvement category. So substantial progress towards the targets. Last year we had 7 out of 18, this year we have 10 out of 18, and then moderate progress towards the target. Last year we had 7 out of 8 and 5 out of 18. And so there is improvement in most of our schools. We continue to have a couple of struggling schools, and that's, as I had mentioned, are the additional resources and interventions that we have deployed to those schools. The next slide is a deeper dive into some of that performance. And what you'll note there again is that we have significant improvement in the majority of our schools, and we continue to see the green and the blue, and that indicates the percentage of points awarded that each school receives. Again, these targets are set by the state. There's a set criteria that schools and the state are measured against, and they get points accordingly. In the next slide, I'll keep us moving in your materials. You will see that the next slide is the impact. It should be momentarily. I want to make sure that everyone in the audience has access to that as well. Gap closing slide. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Can we,
I'm sorry.
can we back up to that slide that went off?
Yeah.
Thank you, that one.
Which
Right
one?
before,
Slide
right
one
before.
before that one?
Yep, right before. Thank you.
All right. The line with all students
Mhm.
and the lowest performing student subgroup, why are those two put together? Why is the overall include the lowest performing when it comes to our average?
Yeah. As you all know, most of our students fall in 3 big buckets in terms of the accountability. We have students who are in low SES. We have students who have special needs. And the last bucket here is English learners. And so many of our students are counted 3 times under the accountability measure.
I just have a hard time wrapping my head around
I
that, why
know.
those kids are
It's-
counting twice.
It's actually 3 times that they count in
Well, yeah,
in many
because if they
cases.
fall into-
That's right.
Right.
That's right. That's right.
Okay.
Yep.
Any other questions?
Next, this is a gap closing indicator. And so what you'll see is that in 13 out of 18 of our schools, that's 72% of our schools, the progress of the lowest performing subgroups was significantly higher than all of that of the subgroups. So this is what we call the achievement gap. Again, these are the 3 buckets that I just indicated. These are English learners, low SES, and student with disabilities. The next indicator is about achievement. As a reminder, the next generation MCAS for both ELA and math is given to students in grades 3 through 8, and then 10th graders. And then next generation MCAS for science for the 5th and 8th graders. And then legacy science for our 10th graders. So in this slide, this is the achievement for ELA. And what you see is that is a comparison between the percentage of students in the grades 3 to 8 that scored in the meeting or exceeding expectations performance on the next generation MCAS. This test is a computer-based test. This is the first year that all of our students take it. We have been moving towards this for the past 3 years. And then what you see is the ELA and the math comparison between 2018 and 2019. Graph on the right is the green, and that's our current performance for 2019. The 2019 grades 5 and 8, it's for science, and then of course the 10th graders for ELA and math is the next generation MCAS. And that one can't be compared to the 2018 because it's a different test altogether. So some of this are moving targets, and we're trying to keep up and do our best in terms of analysis of some of this data. And because this is summative data, it's a one-time shot for students to demonstrate their knowledge. It also gives us this one quick snapshot, but we are measured by this by the state. This is now the achievement in math. Again, it's the next generation MCAS, and this is the percent of students meeting or exceeding the expectations. On the right, it's the green, and that is our current performance, 2019, compared to the orangey, I would say, which is 2018. Here we see the science MCAS achievement, and again, this is the 5th and 8th graders who scored meeting or exceeding the expectations, and then our 10th graders who scored proficient or advanced. This next indicator is the achievement of ELA and math and science. And what you'll notice is that 82% of our schools maintain or increase their percentage of students meeting or exceeding the expectation. 71% of our schools also maintain or increase the percentage of students meeting or exceeding the expectation on the MCAS Next Gen as well.
In looking at those schools and some of the scores between 2018 to 2019 in ELA, is there some common thread that you would find in the curriculum that is causing those particular schools to either go down or remain stagnant?
Yeah, it's a great question. What we've learned is that this is the 3rd year for our K-2 second graders who have adopted a common curriculum, and this is what you see in the schools who have been with the curriculum for 3 years. So again, it gives us good data about some of the materials and resources that our schools are choosing to use with our students.
Any other questions?
The next indicator is student growth percentile, And this question is, how much did the students grow over the year compared to their own academic performance or that of their peers? So what you see here is groups with a mean student growth of 50 or higher are considered by the state as meeting the target, and those who are of average student growth percentile fall between 40 and 59, and an SPG, so student growth percentile of 60, indicates high growth. The majority of our schools, you can see, are in that category of high growth, and then the rest are in the typical growth and expected.
Just, I'm
Committee
sorry,
member Pat
but
Marino.
just as an aside, I remember as a principal, I would put more weight on the student growth as opposed to the actual test scores, because looking at student growth is telling you where the kids began, and you have a measure of how far they've come. It's a clearer picture than the actual MCAS scores. I think the growth scores are probably more valuable to us as a district than the actual test scores. And that's just a Wayback Machine when I was looking at this data.
So what are your concerns about, or your thoughts on regression in the data? Is there any points in the data that you want to point to in terms of regression that would be concerning? It's
No.
just a,
I'm just looking at, we have 83% of the schools that have shown some, their growth has been typical or better, and I think that's a good indication. Again, there's probably work that needs to be done with the schools that haven't made that 40%, which is considered typical, but, to look at growth is very valuable.
thank you.
We agree, it gives us significant data in terms of accelerating student learning, and we do place significant value in terms of growth versus just actual meeting or not meeting expectations.
Any other questions? Okay.
The next indicator is progress towards attaining English proficiency, and as you all know, this is a district that has over 35% of our students who are English learners. So here you see district-wide the percent of English learners that met their English proficiency target, and it is up significantly this year. We compare it to the non-high school grades, which increased by 4 percentage points, and the high school grades increased by 3.4 percentage points. This is measured by access. Students take this test in the late winter, early spring. It's the first measure that we give them in terms of summative data, and we start preparing, the technical aspect of that testing early in the winter. Our next indicator is chronic absenteeism, and this is the percent of students missing 10% or more of their days enrolled. Here you'll see district-wide chronic absenteeism is down significantly, so 0.9 in the non-high school grades and 0.7 at the high school level. You may also remember that we had launched a campaign in the late winter to include an analysis, a root cause analysis of some of the reasons why our students remain chronically absent, and they varied. Everything from my student has chronic asthma, my family situation is difficult for me to bring my student doesn't want to get up from bed, my student was up all night playing Fortnite. I mean, the root causes varied. This was a diverse group of both students, parents, teachers, and administrators who worked on this. They launched campaigns with service providers to include pediatricians, to include dentists. We appealed to them and said, if you have one of our students that has an appointment, please send them back. We shared with families how attendance is being recorded, and as a result, we made significant improvements in that later winter and spring. The other thing we've done for this year is that we adjusted the calendar to ensure that there was equity across the district, and so that families understood when the breaks began, when it ended, All our schools started on the same day. We have the same half-days, so that it became easier for families to take their breaks, to go home and visit, to take their proper breaks, right? So we hope that'll also yield results for the 2020 data.
I just have a quick question in regards to the data that was taken in regards to the root causes for chronic absenteeism. What was the total percentage of students who missed school due to poverty-related issues?
We don't have specific data to poverty issues. I would argue that many of the reasons are mostly challenged by students in our middle school, our teenagers, I would say, in our preteens, with engagement in school and sort of relevancy to what they think school is, like what do I get out of school? They're not seeing quite the connection that this is their next step to then improving many things for them. And then another one that was quite highlighted, and again, I would not attribute this to poverty, but it is our students who have chronic illnesses. There were a few examples with our parents where families mentioned asthma as being a big trigger in the wintertime and having challenges with getting their kids out in the cold weather and what that meant, being fearful that we have recess and it's too cold and that triggers their asthma. And then the last one that we heard quite a bit was this issue of appointments. So they would take their student to a 9 o'clock appointment and then bring them home. So I don't know that I can correlate those to poverty, but I do believe it's one of the many variables.
So when you were assessing the issue, was there any specific data taken to how many students are missing due to medical issues? How many students are missing due to all these issues that were deemed root causes?
I think that's a good idea to conduct a specific survey on the many variables, but we did not conduct a survey of families to say, let's send it out district-wide to have a better understanding on the percentages.
I just have one more question. And then just as a follow-up, so has there been any effort or will there be any effort into changing the curriculum so that's culturally relevant to students in order to engage them more within the school, get them excited about coming to school?
Yeah, we also believe that getting kids to have more hands-on experiences is also part of cultural relevancy. As an example, we have a pilot program right now in the high school for VOC, and so we're taking good data and feedback on that group of students. We currently have 50 students. This is the second cohort, and what we know so far is that those students do not miss school.
I think my question is specifically with regards to, like, let's say if we're looking at English language arts and we're trying to boost performance, are the books that students are reading reflect their culture, their lifestyle? Can the students see themselves within the books? I bring up this example because I attended an event at Andover High, and it's required reading for them to read Latino City. And it's all about our Lawrence residents and how the city transformed to being majority Latino. And so it's not required reading here, that's my understanding. So has there been an effort to change the curriculum so that students can identify themselves in the academic study, and whatever they're studying, can they identify themselves in it?
Yeah, you'll be happy to know that in the high school and middle schools, teachers have quite a bit of autonomy in selecting readings, and I've been a witness to many of those readings. There are teachers who are incredibly sensitive to the culture, to include books that are a diaspora of Puerto Rican descent, of Dominican descent, and Central American descent. So the answer is yes, we have choice in terms of the materials that we choose. And the other piece of this is we don't have that district-wide with specific curriculum, so it's both. I think we struggle to find culturally sensitive curriculum that is manufactured and ready to go. As a result, teachers pull different books and relevancy to students' culture.
I think my concern with that is that there's no oversight of it, and it could vary from school to school. There's no accountability for that culturally relevant curriculum. And I think that's really important if we're talking about chronic absenteeism and we're talking about kids that aren't coming to school because they don't see the benefit or they're not engaged. I think it's really important to ensure that that's uniform throughout the district to make sure that kids are actually wanting to come to school to learn about themselves, about their culture.
You'll be happy to know that principals and teachers are quite sensitive about this, and while they have complete autonomy with the curriculum, they make every effort to be culturally sensitive. So the accountability exists. I am personally in classrooms and in schools every day, so I get to see what the teachers design around the foundation curriculum to build those gaps that we don't have in the foundation curriculum.
I think the beautiful thing about being involved in the community is that I'm within these spaces, I'm within Elevated Thought, I'm tutoring kids after school, and I'm reading things that aren't reflecting the culture. So there's a discrepancy between what you're saying and what I'm actually seeing with the kids. So I just want to make sure that going forward, if we're going to target chronic absenteeism and we're going to say that a reason why kids aren't coming to school is because they're not motivated to come to school or they don't see themselves within the curriculum, like we have to make sure that we're addressing these issues going forward, uniform throughout the district. I'm sorry, school committee member, Mrs. Seward?
So I just wanted to, again, touch upon that question of engagement from middle school students, particularly as it relates to both chronic absenteeism and test score performance. As I was listening to your dialogue back and forth with Chairperson Marianela Rivera, Dr. Rivera, it seems to me that it sounds great that we have these initiatives that are happening, but it would be great to kind of formalize and institutionalize, at least from a policy perspective, what that might look like. And so I am 100% for autonomy in the classroom. I think it's important. I think it factors into the growth of our students academically. At the same time, it would be nice to see some formalization of those institutional practices around how do we engage students, what that looks like, and what are our benchmarks for ensuring that now that we have this information going forward, we're going to see increased engagement. Does that make sense?
Yeah, we appreciate your feedback and Mike. Yeah, thank you. We appreciate the feedback and we agree with you. So I'm not disagreeing that cultural relevant materials and resources are not one of the variables that we have to continue to work on. I'm sort of giving you the landscape of the current autonomies in our open architecture, what I've seen and what teachers have been very creative about. So there's pockets of that. Is it uniform? The answer is no. I've been honest about that. And I think we continue to learn from our students. But the example that I shared with you of the vocational studies, there's no relevant culturally sensitive materials in that learning. The students are very motivated by the hands-on. So by far, that's the most engaging experience that our students had given us feedback that works for them. So we have to learn from that as well.
Any other questions? Thank you.
The next indicators are the high school performance indicators. And this is the 4-year graduation rate. In 2019, the accountability calculations use 2018, so this lags. This is lagging data. It's true for every year. And what you see is that the 4-year graduation rate was up by 0.2%. This indicator is the extended engagement rate. And in 2019, the accountability calculations used the 2017 extended engagement rate. Again, these are indicators that lag. And of the smaller number of the students needing more than 4 years to graduate, the majority are persevering, which is what we'd like to see of our students. It does impact other indicators, which we'll get to in a moment, but the fact that our students are persevering and wanting to graduate, we celebrate that. This indicator here is the annual dropout rate, and the accountability calculations, again, it's for the 2018 rate. This is lagging as well, and the annual dropout rate increased by 1.4 in 2018. We think the hypothesis here is the slide that I just shared with you before. We keep kids longer, but as a result, it counts against the dropout rate. But for us, it's important that students continue to be engaged and persevere towards their graduation. This indicator is advanced coursework completion, and as you know, we're one of the districts that has early college as one of the engagement tools and to advance and accelerate student learning. And so each year, more of our grades 11 and 12 are completing advanced coursework such as AP courses and the dual enrollment for college credit. The two partners that we have are Merrimack College and Northern Essex Community College. So I think for us, the next steps with this accountability data is to really ensure that schools requiring assistance or intervention receive a deep analysis and progress monitoring and additional supports. We've already secured those resources through DESE, who has granted us additional funding to have 7 of our other schools receive progress monitoring later this winter. And then during the budget process, when we ask schools to design their goals to be quite aligned to district goals, so we'll ensure that with the team that school-wide goals are aligned with district goals. We'll continue, of course, to focus on reducing chronic absenteeism. Your feedback on cultural relevancy, resources, and curriculum will certainly be part of this discussion. And I'm happy to take any additional questions.
Any questions? Oh, school committee member, Mrs. Seward.
So it seems like the trajectory of the district is moving in the right direction. However, when I went on the DESE website, which by the way is incredibly difficult to navigate, it took 3 computer screens with 3 or 4 windows each to try to compare and contrast. It did appear that there were some schools that were not meeting expectations very clearly. And so my question is, while I'm hearing that those schools in particular will have monitoring and analysis, what does that really mean, particularly for those students who, in some cases, saw a 3% increase in the number of students who were not meeting expectations, for instance?
So as I had mentioned earlier, we have 2 schools in particular that continue to be chronically underperforming under level 5, and that's 7 years worth. So for those schools, not only is this progress monitoring happening midway through the year, but we have internal indicators to include some formative data, those benchmarks. Those are literacy and math benchmarks, and these are schools across K-8 to include also our high school. And with the help of central leadership and the principals and the staff, design plans for them. I mentioned earlier that some of these interventions include professional development. We have to support our teachers and further understanding where are the gaps, when is the unfinished learning. And additionally, from central office, what are the additional FTEs or other resources that each school needs? In the case of these schools that I have exampled, there is quite a bit of social emotional needs, and so we've added FTEs in the form of counselors, in the form of BCBAs to support that for students, social emotional learning.
And so are you getting any data or data points as to where the drop-off points are? And if so, how are we looking again at institutional practices? So I want to be respectful and mindful of the value of autonomy, but I also think it's important from a district level to have certain standards so that there is uniformity within that flexibility, if that makes sense, right? So we want to have that autonomy, but we also need to make sure that a student's assigned school doesn't impact how they are going to be educated, if that makes sense, right? So there are those kind of institutional, internalized practices that make sure that the playing field is even, no matter which school you're going to.
Yeah, we call that loose tight. So there are certain things that schools with autonomies are very loose about, and that we call the autonomies. And then there's some tightness that happens for schools that are not using well their autonomies. In addition, I'm working with the board on an earned autonomy framework. We have examples of that last year where a few schools, some of their autonomies were curbed. It's the best way I can say it. And so collectively, we decided that those schools were no longer going to have those autonomies until they improved these benchmarks.
And so, final question. As I was trying to look at the way this data was collated, there seemed to be a gap, and in some cases, a significant gap in the number of students that were enrolled and the number of students that actually took the MCAS test. And in one case, there was an 85 student disparity between the number of students that were enrolled in a particular grade and the number of students who actually took the test. And so I'm trying to understand, and I'm sure some of that was due to illness and absenteeism, but is there a reason that those students are not being captured, and how do we capture the students who are technically enrolled, but their scores are not represented?
I'm not aware of that data, so it's hard for me to speak on that. It
Okay.
could be, if you're speaking about 10th graders, I'm not well-versed on that.
Okay.
My guess is, if we're talking about the 10th graders, we have students who repeat the grade, and as a result, they do not repeat taking the MCAS as 10th graders. So there's that discrepancy that could potentially impact the data, but I'm not well-versed in it right now.
Okay, yeah. And like I said, it was hard to kind of comb through to kind of see, and it was also difficult to understand, but it would be helpful going forward to at least make sure that that is the issue, and that we're not missing students in terms of their participation in the process.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Seward. Any other questions? Are you all set?
Oh, I do have one.
Yeah. Okay. Assistant School Committee Member, Mrs. Mariano.
Just an overall question. How did the schools, are the schools' infrastructure able to handle the testing and the requirements that the kids have on a day-to-day basis to work with computers and technology?
It's a great question. So to be honest, our bandwidth, and I'm not an IT person, this is my layman sort of explanation. What I understand is that our bandwidth continues to be stressed. And so every time we add a device to the bandwidth, that stresses the bandwidth. And the good news is we have a lot more devices in the form of Chromebooks to support student learning and to include the summative testing. The bad news is that puts a lot more stress on the bandwidth. And so right now I'm working with our director of IT on the question of like leasing versus buying equipment. You know, leasing is a favorable option because technology expires pretty quickly. So we have to think about the pros and cons of that right now. And so we'll be looking at that pretty closely as it gets closer to doing a lot of testing online.
But kids on, certain schools or kids aren't at a disadvantage because their building isn't up to speed? I guess that's what I'm concerned about.
Yeah, we have blended learning in all of our classrooms, so it's not the only means of instruction, and teachers are incredibly innovative when we have that challenge of the bandwidth being taxed. But it's blended learning, so it's not all online and it's not all, you know, face-to-face, so it's a combination of that.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other questions? I have some questions. I just want to echo the sentiments of my colleague, Mrs. Seward, because I was going through the data last night, and I had to have multiple screens open myself in order to compare the data. My concern is when you present the schools in this alphabet soup sort of fashion, there's no transparency, and there's no opportunity for, if I'm having difficulty with it and my colleagues having difficulty with it, and we're, you know, college-educated individuals, then most of our families are gonna have difficulty, especially those who English isn't their native language and they don't know how to access technology. They're gonna have issues accessing this information and becoming a meaningful member of this process, because I think if the goal is truly to turn around this district, we have to collaborate as a community, as a team, and we need to make parents a meaningful partner in what we're doing here. And so I don't think it's really beneficial for us to put these scores up by alphabet soup when parents need to know how well their students are doing in their schools. So that's my first concern that I just want to throw out there before I ask questions. But my first question, Superintendent Paris, is, to your knowledge, is there any data within the accountability indicators that can be manipulated or altered to mislead the public on the actual improvements under receivership? And if so, what safeguards have you put in place to ensure the reliability of the data?
I'll make the first comment about the alphabet soup. So the great news is that each parent and teachers have this data that is individual to the students, and I think parents really appreciate when their teacher and their principal sits with them one-to-one and in groups, which I've witnessed, to unpack their students' performance. The other great news is that we continue to be one district and measured by this data that, although seems high and broad, is significant and does reveal how we're performing as a district. To your second comment, I'm not aware that there is a way to manipulate this data. You are probably aware that there's several layers and portals, and as challenging as it was for you, the public, to get access to this on the website, it's nearly impossible for us to access it. We have one person who's dedicated full-time to this, and there's no way to manipulate this data.
So I just want to start out by saying that most taxpayers do want to know how the schools in their neighborhoods are doing. It's usually a deciding factor of whether or not they place their students in the schools or they put their kids in private schools. So it is a very important issue to many taxpayers in the community, and I think explicit information needs to be provided. But to my knowledge, there is some data that sticks out because I've been working very closely with the youth of the community and with the parents of the community and with teachers. And I'm concerned about the attendance and how it's being tracked at the high school level. The reason being is because whether on social media or hanging out with the students are bragging about having more than the allotted absences allowed for graduation and still graduating everywhere. Anyway, there's posts on social media about that. There's conversations I've had with teachers about attendance records being manipulated in order to graduate students. So I guess my question is what is the computer software that we're using to monitor attendance data, and is there any way we can use something closely related to medical records to show if someone alters attendance records, who did it and when?
I'll take your first comment, and so with, again, the explicit nature of the data, the invitation remains. So we ask our families and we ask community members, school committee members included, to visit schools specifically to get information about your specific school. Principals and teachers are ready to go. They have all this information, and more importantly, they have information that's very particular to students and their families. To your second point about what software is being used, we use Power Schools. Both students and families have access to see their data to include attendance. And we do have folks in our school who are the administrators who keep track of the attendance. Combined to this, we have policies that are very clear about how we keep track of attendance. I'm not aware of the social media chatter. I prefer to stick to facts. And so what I know to be true is that our teachers and administrators do an excellent job of keeping track of attendance.
I want to be careful when we say the truth, because when the youth come to their elected officials to report concerns, I don't want to disregard that. Whether or not they're posting it on social media or not, they're still coming, and they're still engaging in these conversations about their concerns, especially when it comes to teachers. So within Power Schools, if someone makes a change, if an administrator makes a change or someone makes a change to the data, is it time-stamped and dated who made that change?
Yes.
Okay. Is there a way that we can closely monitor that in the upcoming year to ensure that is happening?
I'm not sure what the question is.
Well, I just want to put on record that there are many concerns that have been reported to me by teachers that are currently working at the high school, that students have been absent more than the allotted times required for graduation requirements, and they're still graduating. So that's a concern. It's a concern when that's being reported to me, and then I'm finding out that students are taking remedial courses at the high school because they're not ready, at the college level because they're not ready for college. So I just want to make sure that students aren't being passed through the line just to boost graduation rates, is what I'm saying.
I'd be happy to follow up on that.
Thank you. I did have another question with regards to third. So I want to focus on the third grade data because there's a correlation between low literacy rates and incarceration. So that's really concerning to me, and it wasn't highlighted within the slides. There appears to be some regression with third grade ELA scores in the achievement level for MCAS scores. So it looks like we regressed. And so my question is to you, What measures are we taking in the upcoming school year to ensure that those children don't get left behind and that we really close not only the achievement gap, but I really want to start talking about it as an opportunity gap to ensure that these kids make effective progress going forward. It's great that we're talking about those who are exceeding and meeting expectations, but I really want to focus on the data that targets the kids that are really struggling.
I can't speak to the data of regression. I don't have the one that you're referencing. I'm happy to further look at that at a different time. But what I can tell you is that we do have interventions in place for students who are still struggling with literacy. The other thing that we're learning is how many kids are disordered versus English learners. And so that impacts the decisions that we make about resources and interventions.
Okay, thank you. Going forward for school committee meetings, I know this is our last school committee meeting for the year, but I think it would be beneficial for school committee members to have that data and to closely track it as well.
Which data is that?
The data for not meeting expectations, the grades for ELA and for math, the grades that aren't meeting expectations, and the schools that aren't meeting expectations with regards to that.
Noted.
Any other questions? Okay. Next item on the agenda is enrollment presentation.
Great, so this next presentation is our enrollment and our current enrollment and then projections. In your materials, you will see that the first slide is enrollment similar to last year, which has us at no significant surprises. We did expect this from last year, and I think this is an update from what we showed you last year. Here we see that there's no changes to building capacity, and yet we still have an increase of more than 1,000 students over 12 years, which is what we've also projected for. It's a steady enrollment right now. This keeps us very happy. As you also know, we have 2 projects, 2 buildings, the Leahy and Oliver Partnership Schools. We expect to increase capacity there in the next coming years. We have robust committees that are designing these schools and planning around that. And as new actually, further in the presentation, we'll talk about buildings and other expectations. So here, this is recent and future capacity. This is the long-term plan. I just spoke about the projected new 2 buildings. So it is requested, we've requested 500 new seats at Oliver, and then we've requested 500 at the Leahy building. In the interim, in the short term, we continue to monitor high class sizes, and so we cap them in central office. We have a pretty good system of looking at enrollment in each grade for each school to include square footage, to include moves, and then we sort of close the classrooms depending on the school. We've added classrooms in existing schools where possible, and then we also rezone when we need to, also when we've closed down classrooms. And again, I'm happy to pause and entertain questions along the way. For the 2019-20 enrollment, we have a slight increase from last year of 120 students across the grades, and you'll see that in 6th, 7th, 8th, and then in 10th and 12th grade. And then offsetting those increases, we have decreases in grades Kinder, 2, 3, 5, and 11. Keeping class sizes high, continuing from the 16-17 year, but fortunately many are not reaching those caps, so we're providing some relief to grades. We really are mindful about our youngest students in that class size, and we provide paraprofessionals to kindergartners, of course, first grades whenever possible, and in any other grades that principals and teachers have identified as needing additional supports. Yes?
So how do these class sizes compare to the region and then to the state?
Yeah, urban class size setting is mixed across the Commonwealth. Larger urban districts contractually have caps. Our neighboring districts also may have suburban districts. We do not have a cap, but we do understand that class size is important. And so we've internally kept these numbers as you see up there. So they're within the range of urban classroom is what I would say across the Commonwealth.
Dr. Rivera?
Oh, yeah, school committee member
Um,
Mariano.
I've said it before, I'm uncomfortable with the kindergarten cap sizes of 22 to 25. Let's say, for instance, there's a classroom with 25 kindergarten students. Let's hope there isn't, but if there is, how many additional support people would go into that classroom for that number of students?
At the very minimum, we have a paraprofessional. And then what principals and teachers do is that they pull for small group in terms of reading and math and other content area with other FTEs to include interventionists, to include reading specialists, to include coaches. So we try to maintain smaller group size with other FTEs in the building. They're not in the classroom full-time. The para is in the classroom full-time.
All right, so it would be two adults.
2 adults.
For the 25
Correct.
students. Which is still taking into account the needs of our kids as they come to kindergarten. That's still too many. And the same with grade 1. I mean, those lower grades is where you really need the support when these kids are coming into the school. Hopefully with the new buildings, do you foresee the 500 extra seats at the Oliver and the 500 extra at the Leahy taking the pressure off the district as far as these lower grades?
It's a good question. I mean, I think we're trending towards that, but it's impossible to predict in 5 years if this number moves up or down. What we are committed to is to try to maintain at the very least these numbers. We do make exceptions, or we accommodate, I should say, differentiate, when teachers and principals tell us this particular cohort needs smaller class size because X, Y, and Z. As an example, last year, the Partham Elementary, we added a classroom to reduce class size because that cohort was quite challenging and complicated in their learning, so we wanted to support the teachers and added an additional kindergarten. So that does happen. It's not always just the para, it's sometimes we add, and that's contingent upon the space in the school. So for example, if we have that challenge at the Tarbox, there's no room to add another classroom. So that's challenging. And so we add the FTE to push into the classroom versus adding another classroom. So it's very dependent on square footage.
I was just going to
Yes.
ask you about square footage too, because it varies throughout the
It
district.
varies.
Again, speaking as a principal of the Leahy, the square
room.
footage in the kindergartens could not support more than 20 kids. Even at 20,
correct.
I used to shudder.
Yes, and so we're aware of schools like the Leahy School, like the Tarbox, and there's many others where their square footage doesn't compare to a school like the Partham, where the square footage of a kindergarten classroom can physically accommodate 23, 24 kindergartners, but at the Leahy or the Tarbox, as an example, cannot accommodate that. So that varies per school.
Okay.
It's an
Thank you.
average. So here you'll see the classes that have reached their maximum, and this of course fluctuate. Principals keep us well informed if there's dramatic changes. You know, for us, dramatic can be 3 more kids. That's pretty significant for us. And between central office, who keeps monitoring registration, and principals and teachers, we keep well track of classrooms that need to be capped. The challenge here is that when we do this, we now move families into a different district. And so we're quite committed to having our families be in their neighborhood school. So that's the challenge here. We try to keep kids in their neighborhood school at all times, but not at the cost of increasing class size, which then becomes very difficult.
This is really alarming. I just want to just say that out loud because I'm looking at pre-K, kindergarten, grade 1, and if you take the 30 million word gap study into account, these kids are coming in, you know, a couple years behind the game. These kids need to be in very smaller classroom sizes. Like the reason why I was spaced out, it wasn't because I was looking at the research, and it says 13 to 17. And so I'm concerned that these large class sizes is going to hinder their progress.
Yeah, you should know that 13 to 17 is private schools. Our suburban affluent districts have a cap of 22 students and up to 25 with a para. I can tell you that from experience because I was in Newton, where it's a very affluent, is our most affluent district, and our class size was 25 students in kindergarten.
I wasn't talking about a cap, I was talking about research, like a study that was done on classroom sizes that are small.
I appreciate
to
that,
show
and what
that
I'm
they're-
suggesting is
Well,
that
let me just
public
finish.
size,
Hold on, I don't
public
wanna have a
class
debate, I wanna
size,
finish my comment, please.
well, public class size is different than what research shows, is what I'm debating.
Right, and my concern is that if we're gonna compare kids apples to apples, if we're gonna compare Lawrence kids to Andover kids, we're gonna compare their MCAS scores, then we need to make things equitable throughout, is what I'm trying to say. And so if the research is reflecting that students do better in a classroom that's 13 to 17 students, if we're gonna say we're under receivership and we need all these supports, these are part of the interventions that need to get done. And things need to be more equitable. I get that, I get there's a difference between urban, suburban, but we need education equity, is what I was just trying to say. And it needs to, the interventions that we do need to be evidence-based.
I just think that this is the wrong audience to appeal that to. I don't disagree with you.
No, and the comments that I'm saying, I'm not saying it because I'm disagreeing with you.
Yeah.
I'm sharing it to my community members because this is research that I've been doing, and these are my concerns. I know that we're dealing with limited space, limited resources.
Well,
and
I think, so in
it's
addition,
concerning to
so
me.
we agree with the research, but what I'm suggesting is this is the wrong audience to appeal that 13 to 17 is the right class size for Lawrence or any Commonwealth district. I think your state legislators, your elected politicians in state capital, including our governor, are the ones who need to hear this
I
conversation.
know, and I don't need to be lectured on how to access my
It's just not
elected
helpful
officials.
conversation.
It's helpful to my community members who are here and present and want to hear that their concerns are being heard. So it is helpful. So I'm just sharing that with my community. We can move on to the next slide. Thank you.
I don't find it helpful. I think that we should focus on our current context, and I think the supports that we're providing, we're doing it in earnest with the resources that we have, and it would be helpful if you joined us in sort of brainstorming and thinking through our current context.
Which is why I propose joint meetings with the LAE, but when it comes to education justice and we're talking about educating kids in our community and we're comparing apples to apples, we really just need to make sure things are equitable, and we need to have these conversations, whether it be at a school committee meeting, whether it be out in the community, whether it be with our state legislators. We still need to have these conversations. And I shouldn't be put down for bringing my concerns up, especially when I'm advocating for my constituents that are present here today.
I appreciate that.
Thank you.
Any additional questions on the class size or concerns?
No, it was just a concern in regards to the class sizes that have reached their maximum.
So we spoke at length about support for the larger classes. And again, when the grades are higher, we do the capping that we just spoke about. And then we deploy additional resources. We spoke specific about the rezoning. We spoke specifics about when the square footage doesn't add up and how do we do that. And so the sample case here is the kindergarten at the Breen. So we have preschoolers in kindergartens here, and 6 classes are all at the maximum capacity, that's 22 students. So we can either close that grade, that's one option. The second option is provide a para to support their larger class size. The challenge here is what I just mentioned earlier, which is if we send students to 2 different schools, now, once enrolled, those families will likely want to keep their students in those schools, causing it's a trickle effect to the other schools and then capacity issues in the other schools. So instead, we like to provide the additional paraprofessional to keep the students in their same cohort in their neighborhood school. And then that ensures that the feeder pattern that we have in this particular example, the Breen, that the students go to SLE. Yes?
Do we have any data on the impact of doing it one way versus the other? And do we understand what the impact is of having extra paraprofessional in the classroom versus sending somebody to a different school?
Yeah, it's challenging because overwhelmingly our families want to be able to be near their student in their school. They cite things like, what if my student has an emergency and now you're sending them to another district? What if I'm a walker, or, when the kids get older, they actually walk with their cohort of students. So overwhelmingly, families want to maintain their district school, but again, not at the expense of really big classrooms. So that's the balance here. We do have options for families, but overwhelmingly, they want to stay in their district school. So this one is the right sizing of Arlington Middle School. This is grade 6. We shared this with you last year, which is we rezoned 17 students and grades, and this might be speaking to your earlier question about when we move students. Here's an example in the middle school grade. So we rezoned this. We asked the families at the Tarbucks and gave them the scenario. We said, look, you're scheduled to go to Arlington Middle. Those class sizes are quite big. There's really no room to add an additional classroom there, and even with an additional para, those classrooms will be very big. You have the option of joining Up Leonard, and so we walked them to what that would be. We provided additional resources, including transportation and access to the school, family nights, evening events, and 17 of those families joined. What we can report is that the students are doing really great. They've had a strong start. The attendance is on par with the students who belong to that neighborhood, and the family seems to be happy with that. Yeah, so that's an example of when we do have to be pretty extreme because the sending school is at a maximum capacity, what happens with those families and students. Here are the projections for 2021. And what we know is that the MSBA data on birth trends, and this is the census, the longer planning, we use current and past enrollment trends and any planning expansions or charter schools and grades. Plus, what we don't know is residential developments and now how those shake up. Is it new families that are coming to these developments? Is it new, or is it families who are relocating from one part of the city to another part of the city in terms of our projections? So here's what we know, which is the top numbers, and then what you see is the current number, the 2019-20. Current cohort size, the reality is that most will move to the next grade, except that we lose some students to charter schools. We also lose some students to independent schools. And then the 5th grade plus vocational options at the high school. We also keep track of charter school expansions. Every time that the state grants additional seats to charters, we keep track of that because that means those students will be moving into those charters as well. And the example here is Community Day and Kim and Webster, which each opened in 2012 with 120 students, but now they're at 400 students. So those were students that were coming to LPS. So what we don't know is the impact of the continual residential. And again, it's not because we don't know what's online. We're in close communication with city officials about what permits they have given to the residents for these apartments to come up. What we don't know is if they're new families that are moving in or movement between the city. So that's tricky for us to determine at this point. Yeah.
So what type of conversations are being had with community development as it relates to the rate of growth that we're having and the number of units that are being added?
Yeah, so we're in close communication with them. They feed us this information as things develop or come offline or they're about to think, even in the early stages. But again, the challenge is they can't tell us if the movement is internal or with new families, but we are in close communication with them. We ask when were the permits. Are the permits ready to go? Is this some in the early phases? When is it planning for opening and leasing or selling? All of those details we do have. We're in close communication with them. And they want to be helpful. They, when they rent, lease, and sell, they talk to families and prospective tenants and their mortgages about which school they're districted for. So this is really important to them as well. And then the last one is, we can't predict for natural disasters. As you all know, in 2017, we had an influx of students from Puerto Rico for Hurricane Maria, and that was something we had not planned for. Here are the projections for 2021. And then on the left-hand side, you will see that kindergarten will remain strong in the neighborhoods where it's strong now based on the preschool trending data. And then in grades 1, 4, and 6, we'll experience a small decrease, and that's also based on the current kinder, 3rd, and 5th grade data. And in the 8th grade, we experienced the growth, and that, of course, is on the current 7th grade cohort. So we're going to look to shift 1 to 2 classrooms to low impact to high impact areas, meaning which schools can accommodate, based on their square footage and neighboring districts, another classroom. And then we keep track of these bubble classrooms to distribute resources where needed. An example of that is at the Weatherby. We have a bubble classroom that we've kept in place for 2 years because that particular cohort needed to be spaced out. So what you'll know is that in the 3rd grade cohort at the Weatherby, the class size is 18. And it's necessary because those students have a higher need and they have the space to accommodate them. And then lastly, just considering strategies to increase the capacity in high impact areas, specifically the Arlington, which has no square footage, and that neighborhood continues to see an increase of residents. So in the interim, we're going to hold steady and be creative and keep good data with our students, with our staff and our principals. And then in the long term, we're going to continue to work with the MSBA in our projects and maximize opportunities with those 2 buildings. And I'm happy to take additional questions.
Questions? All right. So that completes the school committee meeting. Our next regularly scheduled meeting is for January 29th, 2020, for the upcoming school committee. So motion to adjourn the meeting.
So,
Motion to adjourn the meeting has been seconded. All those in favor?
aye.
Oh, the ayes have it.